from St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
I'm Elaine Cha. If After School Special or Degrassi rings a bell, chances are high you've seen one of those TV episodes that broached subjects that were hard to talk about. Things like unplanned pregnancy, parent divorce, running away from home. They might have even been topics a health teacher or school counselor brought up, because a lot of life can happen in your teen years. For Hazelwood East High School student Cathy Kuhlmeier, articles on such subjects belonged in the school newspaper, which she served as editor in 1983. Hazelwood administrators did not agree. Ultimately, Cathy took the school to the U.S. Supreme Court. But in 1988, nearly 35 years ago, the court ruled by a 5-3 decision that public schools have the right to censor students' free speech, creating a landmark limit on the First Amendment. And Cathy Kuhlmeier is here to talk about being censored in 1983 and being named plaintiff in a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and has affected her life ever since. Cathy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You were the editor of Hazelwood East High School's student paper, The Spectrum, in the early 80s. What is the backstory to the 1983 issue of The Spectrum that resulted in the principal censoring what was in it?
We had wanted to do some more in-depth stories than what the typical fluffy type paper article stories that ran in the Spectrum. We typically would run stories about the prom king and queen or the football team and those type of things. And we wanted to identify some more deeper source type stories. So we had gone back to in journalistic terms, what is called the morgue, which is a section that was in the classroom devoted to past story editions, perhaps ideas that never ran. And we came across a paper from 10 years prior underneath a different principal, Dr. Negri, that had run, and those were the exact topics we wanted to talk about. It was teen pregnancy, divorce, marriage, and runaways. And we identified that as being relevant to things that were going on in our school, and we chose to make that the theme of our paper.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk about how that censorship happened?
Sure. We had been working with our advisor, Mr. Sturgis, and partway through working on these articles, Mr. Sturgis left and went into private industry, and that was pretty devastating to us because he was the teacher that hopefully most kids have had in their careers that they could connect with. But we had been moving the process along with the articles, getting them ready, and after he left, they brought in the advisor from Hazelwood Central High School, Mr. Emerson, and it was his practice at his school that he would take the paper down to the principal for prior review. But in our first semester as preparing to become a journalist, we had learned that prior review, prior restraint wasn't okay, and we also learned about the First Amendment case, Tinker versus Des Moines, where students did not shed their rights at the schoolhouse gate. So when it was Mr. Emerson's practice to take the articles to Mr. Reynolds, the principal, for review, they decided that the articles were too mature and for an immature audience, and therefore they chose not to run the articles.
So I understand that over time, your understanding of why the stories were cut, that changed. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, initially after the paper was censored, we went down and we spoke with Mr. Reynolds and asked for his, explain to us what's going on. This isn't the paper that we produced. We don't want to sell this paper. And he came back with that comment that the articles were too mature for an immature audience. And I asked him and made the comment, I said, if you're old enough to get pregnant, shouldn't you be old enough to read about it? Because the articles didn't have the content of saying this is the how-tos and the why-fors of pregnancy in high school. It was more of think about your decisions before you potentially impact a whole lot of other people in your world. And he said, well, if you don't sell the paper, you won't have the next edition. And that next edition to be published was the senior accolades paper. And so the seniors took a vote on it, and they opted to go ahead and sell the paper. But his justification at that point was just the sensitive nature of the stories. But years later, have crossed paths with him again about 10 years ago, and we were at a symposium at University of Missouri, Kansas City at the law school with the top 5 First Amendment cases in the country. And Mr. Reynolds was posed the question of, so why did you really cut the articles? What happened? And he said, oh, actually, I never really read the articles. It was a budget problem. We didn't have the money to publish the articles, and there was an audible gasp in that room because people recognized the fact you've changed the course of history, and here you are saying you've never actually read the articles.
So it was a revision that you learned about that really changed your view on what happened.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. The stories themselves, can you tell us what the stories themselves were who they were about?
Sure, absolutely. The teen pregnancy story, we had a large population in our high school. There was about 2,500 students there, and on any given time, there were probably 30 to 40 young ladies that were pregnant in the school. And we chose that story because, again, we wanted to identify to the students that, this is a choice that's impacting more than just you, and was hoping to get the girls to reconsider teen sex. Out of the group of girls that we talked to, we settled on 3 girls, and their stories were all very different accounts of what they were experiencing. And one girl was basically, it was sunshine and rainbows, and she couldn't wait to have a baby. The other girl we chose was, okay, I'm pregnant and I have to deal with it. And the third one was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing I could have allowed to happen in my life. But we inserted a blurb to the beginning of the story that said all of the names had been changed because we wanted to protect their identities. And then we also went so far as to remove every single name in that entire 2-page spread. So there was no identifying marks within there unless someone intimately knew the people involved. Mm-hmm. We went so far as to make sure that all of the comments were accurate. So once the articles were written, we took the stories back to those that were involved on it. We said, if everything is correct, would you review it and sign off on it so we know that it's accurate? And then because most of the students were minors, we said, well, let's go one step further. Would you also take it home to your parents and let your parents review to make sure they're on board with it? If they are, ask your parents also to sign it. So we were doing the right and responsible things as a journalist, which we were taught, to make sure all of our sources were accurate and all of the comments were accurate with what we were putting into the paper.
So you went through a very rigorous process, clearly, and you were at the time a junior in high school, and this is with a group of fellow teenagers, which is quite remarkable. If you think about sometimes adult journalists and how they fail to live up to those standards. Now, as a junior in high school, starting to fight censorship of student journalism, it was the start of a long fight. And by the time the decision came down, you were already a senior in college. What was it like to follow that case through so much of your education and young adult life?
Well, it didn't go exactly as planned because I went away to college at Southeast Missouri State, and going back in time that far, cell phones weren't really a thing at that point. So the attorney failed to keep in contact with me, and I didn't know what was going on. So as this case is gaining momentum and it's now into the U.S. Supreme Court, I didn't know about it. So the case that carries my name, that's been a part of my life now for 40 years,
wow,
I wasn't present at the U.S. Supreme Court. But it has helped to shape who I am because it has taught me a lot of life lessons that to be thorough in what you're doing. Don't be afraid to stand up and talk about things that are important to you. I try, and when I speak to students across the country, I try and empower them to use their own voices. But as I went through college and everything, I just kept focused on my studies and just tried to do the right thing, did the occasional interview. It wasn't as relevant during that point in my life as what it is now, going back on it, because now I am more of an advocate for free speech, and I do travel and promote on the case and just try and educate the students as well as, adults and college students just about what their amendment rights are and why this is it's still an important decision and still affects people daily.
And that work that you are doing, traveling around the country, speaking engagements, does that have to do with your formal career, with what you do for a living?
It really does not.
And what is it that you do now?
I'm a workers' compensation adjuster.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the takeaway from that is that the background in journalism did give me very good formative time on investigating. So when I'm doing investigations for workers' compensation claims, I think that helps a lot to really do very in-depth digging on what I need to know to best take care of the claimant and to potentially protect employers as well if there's any fraudulent things going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, from what you have shared thus far, what's very clear to me at least is that the censorship of student publications, adults hold positions that enable them to make all kinds of decisions about what should and shouldn't be published. You've said that you do speaking engagements and other activities to help people understand what their First Amendment rights are. But does that relationship between adults and youth have anything to do with the reason you've shared your story so widely and in so many different ways?
It does. My own son was censored during his junior year of high school, and the way that things mirrored what happened to me is quite ironic. But it's because I saw that happening to my own child that it really made me want to continue to fight for students and advocate for them, because threats were being made to the kids at his high school. And this high school that he attended in Springfield, Missouri is, I'm sure, not unlike most schools across the country, how valuable scholarships are to students. And when this advisor was telling the kids that if they pursued actions any further, she would revoke letters of recommendation to universities that she had written on their behalf. And that was very much a threat to the kids. She also told my son that he wouldn't be the editor-in-chief next year. And the point of it is the kids should not be afraid to be in a journalism program. They shouldn't be feeling that they need to self-censor themselves over issues because threats are being made by teachers that don't understand clearly what student rights are. And if we cannot work with kids in the high school to help allow them to critically think and not be afraid of the self-censorship, we're going to end up losing journalists across the country because it promotes a problem. That they are intimidated by things, and that's not the society that we want our kids to be growing up in. It's also become an issue for advisors who are finding themselves threatened with tenure. When I go and I speak at state capitals to work on getting new voices laws passed, that I hear so many sad stories where teachers are just like, I'd rather not teach than be threatened to lose my job. What kind of environment are we creating if this is what the tone is in our high schools or our universities? That's not the tone that we need to be setting. They need to feel free that they can express themselves, do so respectfully, but also be able to share their word for critically thinking students. We need to continue to build up and support our youth.
And that is certainly something that extends beyond the realm of journalism and just being a critically thinking and acting member of society. Cathy Kuhlmeier, we're so grateful that you spent some time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Thank you for listening. I'm Elaine Cha.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.